To be a good leader, you absolutely need to be in and understand the detail. But if you're not in the detail, who the hell is?
Introducing Tobi Pierce,
the entrepreneur who sold sweat to U.S. giant
for a reported $400 million.
One of the most obvious ones is that people run on the assumption that recruiting a new employee is going to add any value to their business. You'd be surprised how much you can not do in business and still make progress. Treat them well, give them engaging work, and give them a degree of autonomy, help them win, and they'll be more engaged than whether or not you've got comfy bean bags and fruit plates every morning.
What about if I said a statement of like, some people are made for it and some people aren't?
I completely disagree with the idea that everyone could, would, and should be an entrepreneur. Most founders or management level employees think that they are very good at what they do. And the reality is that they're okay. They go, oh, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm a specialist. That's a complete lie. That doesn't make you a specialist. It doesn't even make you half good at it.
The next topic I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, which was risk. Can you talk to that a little bit?
If you live in a fear mindset where you're not willing to risk anything forever, regardless of your context, you're not going to get very far. There is so much productivity leakage in business that comes from fear and avoidance, as opposed to honesty and courage. Don't expect extraordinary outcomes unless you are capable and willing to do extraordinary things.
Loneliness in business. How do you think about that and how do you deal with it?
Especially in business. Loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of connection or capacity to relate. A lot of this loneliness comes from a lack of courage and a lack of self-belief.
What are some of the common assumptions that you think people make when it comes to those decisions?
I would argue that one of the biggest traps that almost everyone falls into is...
So, welcome back.
Mate, thanks for having me again.
It's been a while. I was trying to think back to when we did the last one, but it's probably been 2 years now. I would have...
A couple of years. We're in a sunny estate now as well.
Yeah. We're in Gold Coast at the moment. I definitely, on my plane ride home when I'm checking the weather of what I'm about to walk out to into Melbourne, it's definitely thoughts go through my head of like, what am I actually doing?
Man, I never realised. So I lived like most of my life in Adelaide, other than a lot of travel for work. I never realised until I was doing kind of a week in Gold Coast and a week in Adelaide how much I actually really enjoyed the sunlight, number one. But number two, how much it wasn't really that sunny and warm for a huge part of the year in Adelaide. It never really occurred to me until moving.
I am like in that mode right now, which I'm sure you would have went through of, should I? Like, should I move?
100%,
Should I do like
100%?
And I'm just like even the sun coming up earlier here is just a massive,
huge, and also going down a bit earlier too, because in Adelaide we used to have like really late sunsets during summer, like literally like 8:30, 9 p.m. It would still some nights be quite sunny. Yeah,
and that's a problem. We're going to dive straight into it, mate. Big question that, I mean, we've had a few conversations off air, but the idea of, and it's something that even me now going through what I'm going through, the measurement of success when it comes to financial investments. Mm-hmm. And also one of the big questions that has been playing on my mind is, it's all good measuring success in retrospect.
Yeah.
But how do you understand, like, what's the framework of making a financial investment in your business for something that, might be an investment into the future, something that will bring you a return later on? Because that's something that, it's been top of my mind. Am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Yeah. But would love to kind of touch on that with you.
Yeah. Look, it's important in these discussions, it's important to remember that context matters a lot, when making these decisions. So if you're right at the beginning of your journey, you don't really truly actually have a lot to lose, so you kind of should risk it for the biscuit, if that makes sense. But if you're kind of already an organization that's trading, growing, hopefully making a bit of money and a bit of profit, I think the situation changes just a little bit. So I've said many times before, every decision in business is an investment decision, and the important thing here is not to get caught up in the idea that investments and speculation are the same thing, because they're not. And what I mean by that is that most people start their investment decision process from saying, oh, well, where am I going to put my money? Where am I going to deploy my capital to make the best return? A much better way of thinking about this is, where am I going to put my money where I won't completely destroy it, and hopefully I'll also make a return on the other side? And this, this adopts an idea from a very famous book called The Intelligent Investor, written by Ben Graham, who was a guy that Warren Buffett learned a lot off about investing in general. And the simple principle is that the biggest risk in investing is actually that you destroy your money, right? Because if you lose 50% of your wealth, you have to make 100% return to get back to the start point, right? as opposed to making 0% return but not losing any money. You're still at the starting line, right? And so from a business perspective, I've always tried to train my management team to think about this in a really simple way. You kind of got three primary considerations. What's the rough cost going to be? What assumptions are you making? And therefore, what do you think the return is likely to be as a result of that? And obviously, where most people get caught up here is the assumptions. So that we can quantify how much this will cost. We can roughly determine what it will return if the assumptions are reliable. And most people, truthfully, haven't spent enough time trying to develop the skill and capability to determine, well, what are the appropriate assumptions and are these actually reliable? And so as a result of that, their decisions actually become speculation, not investment, because it's not based on thorough analysis. So it's literally, you may as well be kind of striving to win the lottery. You're not really actually making a conscious investment decision, if that makes sense.
What are some of those, obviously context matters, you said it before, but what are some of the common assumptions that you think people make when it comes to those decisions?
There's heaps. So, one of the most obvious ones is that people run on the assumption that recruiting a new employee is going to add any value to their business, right? And I know that might sound counterintuitive, right? Because people normally go, we're growing, we're kind of getting more employees, but you'd be surprised how much you can not do in business and still make progress. But a lot of people attach this almost, kind of a reliance on if I can't get this done, I'll just get more people, more money will solve the problem. But that's almost never true. Another one is, we'll have a really beautiful looking office because that will engage our employees more. Treat them well, give them engaging work and give them a degree of autonomy, help them win, and they'll be more engaged than whether or not you've got comfy beanbags and fruit plates every morning, so people and this is the whole idea here, right? What is the value that you get back, from a lot of these decisions? Having more employees doesn't make you more money. Having a nicer office never really makes you more money either. People will want to invest in huge amounts of branded material, branded pens, branded books, branded bottles, branded this, that, and the other, and whatever. In some cases that's useful, but in a general sense, the majority of the time it's that's not only often a waste of capital, it's also a massive distraction. Are they the greatest priorities in your business right now? Is that kind of going to get you where you want to go? And one of the really important lessons here is also not only whether or not a investment is good, bad, or otherwise, is this the right time to make that investment? So that's what I was going to ask. Context is really important with decision making. This can be a really, really thorough, rigorous analysis process we've gone through to make a really great decision, but we're not going to do it now because the timing is wrong. And in the same way that you can have this is the right time to be making these decisions, but make a terrible one. Right?
Yeah. Do you have any frameworks around that or benchmarks? So maybe from a numbers perspective,
Sure.
The way I kind of have always thought about it in my head is okay, maybe you could be a percentage of profit into some sort of future investment. But is there any way that you kind of think about that? Because that's me just off a whim,
Yeah, sure. So if again, there's a lot of context and detail that matters here, but I think in a simple sense, so one organisations that I own sells about sort of $30 million a year, give or take, worth of product. And we know in that particular organisation, based on a couple of different expense lines, but by the time we kind of get down to the bottom, just to keep it simple, by the time we get down to the bottom, if they're making about a 20% EBITDA margin, that's good. So long as the amount of money that we're spending on CapEx or kind of large forward-looking investments is not sort of above 20 to 25% of that EBITDA, right? So because a lot of the time people get caught up and be like, oh, we're making heaps of profit because we just capitalize these expenses and remove them effectively from our P&L, and they hide them and they're not really conscious of what's happening. And so when we look at this from a CapEx perspective or from an investment perspective, I'm normally saying, so long as we don't go too far from 20% EBITDA margin in this company and we don't go too far above this percentage of CapEx, and we believe from analysis that we're going to kind of 3 to 5x our money from that investment over a 3-year period, well, then that's a great decision that we can make. If those things aren't true, then either one, it's not going to suit our organization, or two, there has to be some other significant variable that sits outside of that we need to understand that's going to kind of assist us in making that decision. And what I mean by this is a lot of people will justify, so the trap, right? The investing trap that people fall into is that they go, I'm going to spend this money today for this return in the future, but they're not able to bridge that equation by saying, well, these are the reliable assumptions and data points that are going to make that happen. And so then if you say, well, we have to maintain this profit margin, I won't make an investment unless we can maintain this profit margin, or there is some outstanding information that says we should make it, that removes a lot of those silly ideas that frankly kind of shouldn't really ever happen in the first place, right? But a lot of people won't have that discipline. They'll go, oh, we can sacrifice 5% profit this year because it's for a 3-year, 5-year return. Can't tell you how it's going to return, can't tell you when, can't really tell you why or exactly what that's going to look like, but I can just tell you.
And that's where that 25% mark comes in, because
Yeah.
it's a benchmark. It's
Yeah.
it's like, cool, we've got this to spend. It kind of creates restriction.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the inverse is true, right? So just one other rule that I have is I have every company that I am a major shareholder in or have some kind of management input, I force them to make a slush fund, right, every year in their budget. And depending on the type of company,
I like the sound of that, by the way.
yeah, it's not boat parties. It's not boat parties, but it's But yeah, the slush fund basically is, depending on the business, somewhere between 0.5 and sort of 3% of revenue. So this money is just kind of parked aside and it's in the budget, and we assume every year we're going to kind of spend that money on something, right? But that is after all of your other functions, expense lines are already taken care of. So the only way you get access to that money is if it's a significant over and above investment opportunity that you can convince the whole management team will have this return based on this reasonable set of assumptions. And the benefit of that also is that then you're not kind of trying to scrape money away from the profit margins. It's just baked into the way that the company operates. So every year we know we're going to have, depending on the size of the company, 50 grand, 500 grand, $1 million or whatever it may be. We have just money that we can invest, but there's a predefined set of criteria that have to be checked to unlock that money.
And do you think about it in the sense that you would have different cadences for different sizes of the company?
Yep, yeah. So to keep this like kind of reasonable, I would normally say you're probably removing a whole bunch of like angel seed size companies, like small size companies. You're probably removing them. So these businesses are probably already doing a few million, maybe 3 to 5 million a year in revenue or more, anywhere up to hundreds of millions in revenue. But the one of the benefits that you get of trying to run a business this way is, as a founder or shareholder, you don't have to rely on you being the wise, intelligent one that has all the ideas and does all the thinking. You've built a beautiful framework that actually helps develop other business people in your company. One of the principles I run by from a management perspective in this regard, I always say to management teams, I'm like, don't worry about being the best marketer or the best product person or the best finance person. Worry about being good at those things, but becoming the best business person that you can. Because you can only be so good as a marketer who doesn't understand the business. You can only be so good at product if you don't understand the business, right? And when I say understand the business, I mean, what are the impacts of everything that your skill set currently does and on the entire organization? How is this going to change the current and near-term or long-term future state of the business in its entirety? Not just can you build a better product or can you run a better ad, if that makes sense.
Is that, you just mentioned like the word the business, right? Be good at the business, and that makes a lot of sense. But is that, and then you kind of, the follow-up to that, I just would love to clarify, you mentioned your skill set. So is that individual to the person? Like some people, like are more sales-led, they're more sales-led. Some people would be more product-led. Like, is it relative to the individual, or is there a specific set of skills? And I'm sure it's probably a little bit of both, but is there, like, what are those skills?
Yeah, there's a bit of a Venn diagram if you want to think of it in that way. So to give a couple of examples, the common ones that people fall into, right? Normally advertising and marketing people will go like, oh, we're winning, our CAC is great and our ROAS is great. But they have no actual consideration for margin. And so if they're not considering the product, the kind of average cost price versus average sale price, marketing expenses, therefore kind of gross margins and contribution margins, they have no way to actually make an intelligent marketing and advertising decision. None. All they can do is score against themselves, but they can't score the business. Is the whole business doing well, right? In the same way, a product person will go, oh, this is the best product ever. We're going to enter the market, be super competitive on price. This is what we're going to sell it for. So, well, hold on. But like, what's it cost? How much did it cost to get to our warehouse? What was the packaging? So on and so forth. Oh, well, crap, if it's going to roughly cost us this much to sell it, it's not actually really any margin left over, right? And then, but that supplier has a minimum order quantity of 20,000 units. Oh, that's going to suck up 40% of our free cash. So like if you're only thinking about your immediate functional, responsibilities, you end up leaking a lot of value. And the problem that people experience in business from this is that not all of your bad decisions in business are going to be visible now or soon. Most of your bad decisions in business won't be visible for 3 years, and that's only going to happen if you're paying attention, because a lot of bad decisions remain invisible for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. People don't know normally until it's way too late by that time.
Yeah, that rings true. It's like a naivety, isn't it?
100%.
Kind of like you said it, you don't really realize, or if you actually want to realize your mistakes probably sooner, I would assume.
Yeah, 100%. And this is the whole idea of be a better business person. Don't just be a product or sales and marketing, individual. And that goes for management teams and the founders as well, because practical reality is that most people start with a specific skill set and then they build towards a general skill set from a founder's perspective. What I mean by that is that there's not many people that have a general, well-rounded business set and then go, I'm going to found a company now. The majority of founders are either very product-oriented initially and then they become business people, or they're very sales and marketing-oriented and they become a business person over time. But until they kind of start to and or get over that hump of transitioning to a business person, they're not aware of all these considerations, and the lack of awareness there is then what kind of kills them 2, 3, 4 years down the line. And maybe at that point, like I was saying, most of these bad decisions don't become visible for 2 or 3 years, and that might be the point when you want to go fast. But you can't go fast now because you weren't paying attention or didn't have the appropriate knowledge earlier on.
We're putting together a dashboard, right? A business dashboard. What are we tracking for? And maybe let's cap it to I don't know, what do you think's a reasonable number in terms of, there's obviously so much you can track,
Huge.
but what are the big rocks?
Well, just to give you a headline example, right? For most e-com businesses, I think there's about 55 to 60 core metrics that they need to be across.
50
right?
to 60. That would hurt a lot of people's hearts.
It would, right? And just to be clear, you could massively shorten that list, and with that small core set of metrics, you could have a general idea about what's going on, right? But if you truly want to understand, then you need more layers. So just to give you a really great example, right? A lot of people will look at the e-commerce business model and go, oh, well, it's traffic multiplied by conversion rate, multiplied by AOV, winning. That's what it is, right? And you go, oh, okay, but the average order value, simplistically, is constituted by average number of units per order and the average sale price per unit. And you go, okay, but those two things, the latter of those, the average price per unit or average sale price per unit, however you want to look at it, that's dependent on the product mix. So do you have are your products roughly all the same price, or do you have some very cheap and very expensive products? Because that's going to massively...
And are some different margins.
This is the next point. So then even if that's what they sell for, well, what's the incremental margin on those? But then you've got shipping and the average shipping cost. So what percentage of your orders are free shipping versus paid shipping? If they are paid shipping, what are they? If they're free shipping, what's the cost that you wear? So the list goes on, right? But if you were building a more simple dashboard, for a business, you need to start by having a few headline financial metrics, which is normally going to look like revenue, COGS and gross margin, cost of sales and contribution margin, OPEX and EBITDA. They're kind of your hygienic, very basic, financial metric list. From depending on the business model, you also probably want to have a series of operating, what I refer to these as operating metrics, which will normally be a combination of. So if you were looking at an e-com business, you got traffic, customers, repeat purchase rates, order values, those sorts of things, and you could probably get away with about 10 or 15 of those if you wanted to. And if you had nothing else other than those, you could have a really good read on that business, right? But the success in business doesn't come from having a good dashboard and looking at it. The success in business comes from knowing what those things mean and then being able to appropriately dictate tactical action or remediative action in real time. And this is the big gap that you see with a lot of founders and management teams, is they think that knowledge wins, but skill does. Knowledge doesn't actually get you the game, right? Skill, or your capacity to apply that knowledge in real time for the benefit of the business, is what gets you the gains. And a lot of people know what CAC is, or traffic, or conversion rate. And a lot of people know how to diagnose the issues in real time, figure out what's going wrong and why, and then take action immediately to resolve it. There's a huge difference between the two.
It's kind of, that just as you were talking, I'm just keep thinking about that word naivety, right? It's like, because you want to have that short refractory period.
Yeah,
I feel like that's probably like, for me, being the thing that I'm starting to understand now is like, okay, mistake, you don't make, you know, like you got to do everything you can not to make that again. And you only do that from actually applied learnings there. So,
well, yeah. And, you know, I would argue that one of the biggest traps that almost everyone falls into is the very poor estimation of their own degree of mastery in a subject matter. So most founders or management level employees think that they are very good at what they do. And the reality is that they're okay. That's it, right? And the simplest way of thinking about this is that, well, not everyone that plays a sport becomes great. We know that, right? Not every business that ever starts becomes great. So we can accept in those simple ideas that not everyone that does those things is great. But for some reason, people think that in business in their field, whether it's accounting or marketing or product, they go, oh, I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm a specialist. That's a complete lie. You've been doing this for 10 years, and if you're like most people, you've probably been repeating roughly the same thought patterns for 10 years. That doesn't make you a specialist. It doesn't even make you half good at it. But people don't want to accept that, and this comes back to an idea we've spoken about a couple of times before, which is that the actual knowledge required in business it's large, but it's not unfathomable. It's not impossible to attain. The biggest barrier is actually the emotions in business, because if people are able to start their journey in any skill set, marketing, sales, or product, and go, I don't know a lot, and 5 years later still say, I still don't know a lot, that's really emotionally confronting. But most people don't want to do that, and even less founders want to do that, because if you empathize with them and their experience, they started this business, it's successful because of them, they're winning, they're right, and there's a whole bunch of people, if they've been fortunate enough to build a team, I'm the reason they're all here, when almost none of that's true either, right? But they don't want to acknowledge that or the potential for that, because that's vulnerable, that requires courage, and it also, a lot of people would interpret that as poor leadership and management, whereas in my own journey, I realized over time that being vulnerable and honest and saying, I have really no idea here, is actually a far better way to lead than not, because people kind of see through the fake confidence and the crap really quick, right? But when they see you say, I'm not actually too sure, but I believe in our team's ability to figure it out, that's actually much more inspiring and motivating to be around than someone who pretends that they always know and then momentarily screws it up.
Yeah, and I could imagine that it would become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Self-fulfilling prophecy, for sure.
Like with people, like because look, as you get bigger and bigger, and you earn, your earnings go up and up and up. Like that's probably the one thing that I reckon you constantly got to catch yourself.
100%.
As a founder, that's like it's there was a quote. I'm trying to think what it was, but you only learn bad lessons running downhill.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, that's it's when you're running downhill or when things are going really well that you make some of those big mistakes that probably come back to haunt you later on. Yeah,
absolutely. And, this whole idea of, making mistakes and reflecting, right? And, something that I regularly think about this in my own journey. So I have either directly spent or been responsible for managing more than $500 million in advertising, and I still don't think I know a lot about it.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot of money when you think about some of the budgets that are out there. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And I look at that and I'm like, I have a really thorough grasp of some of the fundamentals. And recently I sat down with someone who does a lot of this, and has been doing it for a long time as part of their career. And I sat there and I'm like, oh, this is just epic. I'm learning so much from having this conversation. Yeah. And I sat there and reflected on it afterwards. I'm like, I don't think that many people that have spent $5 million on advertising would be happy to acknowledge new information and then take it away. And this is, in my opinion, one of the core differentiating characteristics between people and founders specifically that go a little way versus go a long way, is the ones that are more focused on learning and getting better than how good they are. Mm-hmm. So if they're spending a lot of time being like, oh, okay, yeah, well, what's next? What's next? That's more valuable than I've learned that. The former is something that people can use, anyone can use to get further in life. The latter is an incredibly limiting mindset and something I commonly refer to as a very unsafe way of living your life. Because if anything changes in reality, you'll be none the wiser because you spend all your time thinking that you already know, right? And so you can't teach a man something if he already believes he knows it, right? And as far as business is concerned, there's a direct relationship between that and your capacity to make more money.
So I'm interested to hear about your personal anecdotes, experiences around managing
Sure.
those dashboards, like more from a tactical perspective. Like, is it something that you went out there and you kind of built these things yourself? Are you using your basic zeros and your accounting platforms and softwares? Like, how do you actually go about tracking and managing some of these benchmarks that we're talking about? Like, obviously you got P&L, that's pretty obvious, but outside of that, like...
Yeah. So I think importantly, I think the first thing actually is that I think you as the founder need to be the one to design it. And what I mean by that is that if you rely on an accountant to build your P&L and a marketing person to build this and a salesperson to build that for the first time, right, then you're none the wiser. Is this a good or a bad idea? Where does the data come from? Does it have integrity? Is my definition of that metric the same as their definition? There's so much variability. So I actually always encourage people, especially people that are very early on in their journey, I'm like, well, go figure it out. Write a list of your own metrics. Where are you going to get the data from? How are you defining it?
It's also one of the like, just going through your P&L and actually going through your line items, like actually, and then dissecting them. You don't have to be all the time, but like I found that personally one of the most helpful things. One, you're picking up the costs that shouldn't be in there. But two, it's like you can start to understand, like if you're getting your bookkeeping done or something like that, like for me, I was like, I figured we went through P&L the other day and you know, I was like, you know, can you tell me about this? This just seems to be a bit weird, a bit off. And I was like, anyway, he you know, turns out that it was being, you know, there was an allocation that was going completely wrong. And now, you know, completely, you know, shifted our margins, right, in terms of making that adjustment happen, but wouldn't have picked up on it otherwise, you know?
Well, and this is part of the thing, right? Like I believe, and a lot of people disagree with this, but I believe that you need to be in as much detail as possible, both early on, in my opinion, for a decent amount of time. You're in your journey as a founder and a manager or a leader, even if it's not your business. And a lot of people will say, to be a good leader, you can't be in the detail. I completely disagree with that. To be a good leader, you absolutely need to be in and understand the detail. Because the fundamental truth is you are in that position because you've gone further, worked harder, learnt more, and achieved better results, presumably, than the majority of the people that report to you. So that means you understand things about those details that they don't. So if you're not in the detail, who the hell is?
I would assume it comes back to what you were saying before around the business, right? Like that word, the business. It's like well, all these little things that are happening in the company are inputs.
Yeah.
And like, you know, if you're like, oh, well, you know, gross margin, we want to see an uplift of 5%. How?
But this is the point, right? So yeah, going back to your question, how do you kind of go about managing them? So the first thing is I think that the founders, or at least the founder and management team, should collaboratively design those dashboards. The second thing is that you have to have routine. The second thing is you have to all agree what those words mean. Because if there's any variability in what you think it is and I think it is, then they're redundant conversations, right? So once you've designed and defined, right, then the most important thing after that is a really structured, recurring set of forums for you to investigate, you know, these metrics, right? And then the way I normally tell people to think about this is set the frequency of these different types of meetings based on your ability to impact different metrics, right? So it's quite hard to, you know, impact margin on a daily basis. So you're probably not going to kind of try to do that. But things like your advertising, ROAS, CAC, traffic, you know, this, that, the other, these are things you can kind of meaningfully move day to day. Then month to month, you might be able to make larger P&L decisions, this, that, and the other. So your report that you do daily or weekly is presumably going to be much smaller than the one that you do monthly. Now, once you've set those forums and the list of your metrics that you'll review at those different points in times, then those conversations need to be structured for one thing and one thing only, and that is the improvement of results against budget. Now, the statement at the end of that, against budget, therefore suggests the idea that you kind of have to have a budget, right? Now, a budget isn't mandatory for every company, and especially ones that are really early on, because so much is going to change and it's very unpredictable. But once you've gotten to some degree of stability over time, it's very worthwhile having one. And it's not just worthwhile having one for the obvious reasons of managing spend and setting goals and whatever, but it's also because a well-run financial planning cycle is, in my opinion, the best way to develop your team members, align their understanding, and actually drive performance against reality. And what I'm kind of emphasizing there is people will set goals that are just completely unreasonable and ridiculous. So they'll have dashboards and then everything's red because they're like, oh, we're going to grow 200% this year. But that comes back to the initial conversation around investments, right? Those assumptions were fraudulent, right? They were never going to be real. They didn't stand up to any form of basic analysis. And so if you have these nicely designed dashboards that kind of link to your budget and you have these meetings on kind of weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis, whatever they may be, now you've got a management team and or yourself that are kind of locked into this cadence of like, well, we're going to review what's happening against what we agreed was the reality of our business, which is this, dashboard or scorecard, if you will. And the thing that we're scoring ourselves on is the variance to what we predicted was going to happen. So then every time you update your predictions, kind of quarterly is normally the frequency, well, you get less ridiculously aspirational because you don't want to be the person that says, oh, well, I thought we were going to hit a CAC of $20, but it's actually 40. You don't want to be in that position, and that has big flow-on effects to the business. So some of these, designing this operating process forces an adoption of the idea of like, what's the whole business impact, not just my metric of customer acquisition cost or whatever it may be. The only other layer that I try to get other organizations to adopt is that if you were to go through your whole P&L and this list of metrics, I try to assign a leader or a manager to each of those things. So even if you're not currently sophisticated enough to have like functional P&Ls reviewed monthly, this, that, the other, that's okay. But you can at least say, well, look, like traffic and conversion rate, AOV, these sorts of things, these are kind of owned by our e-com marketing advertising team. Things like, kind of margin, this, that, and the other, they're going to presumably be largely owned by the product team. And so you can start to kind of allocate some of these metrics to these people because then the performance conversations become really easy, right? It's like, well, I employ you to get this result. You told me that result was reasonable to achieve. We are or are not achieving that result, which is, again, you're managing them to variance of their own expectations, right?
I like that a lot. How... Is there a certain level that you have to be at to be able to do that? Like, or is it more in, I would assume the bigger the team, the more the budgets and these kind of things play a significant role?
I think in business, one of these things, one of the ideas in business that's really important to understand is like right tool for the right problem at the right time. And so most businesses of any size have some form of reporting. But that's a very, very, open to interpretation word. So if you're a small team of like 2 or 3 people, it's like you could probably get away doing nothing other than just a basic weekly report. And there's probably not much value in doing a lot more because by the time you create a bigger report, half your week is going to be gone.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the tricky thing as a small business.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to, I try to come back to this simple idea. It's like, just do what makes sense. Just be practical and not, just to be clear, being practical is a far cry from doing what's easy. Like they're not the same thing, right? And I think a lot of the time in business, people think that what they're doing is the obvious, logical, practical, reasonable thing. But what they're really doing is just defaulting to the easy out because it's a uncomfortable topic or something they're not familiar with or it's emotionally confronting. And this is there's so much productivity leakage in business that comes from fear and avoidance as opposed to honesty and courage.
I feel that in my bones too. I feel like it's one of the things you have to get good at, like, okay, why am I, like as a founder, it's like, why am I avoiding this? Why am I avoiding this? That constant question of.
Well, it comes back like that. So the rude answer to a lot of these conversations with a lot of founders is they go, oh, I'm worried about X, Y, or Z happening, or I'm afraid, right? And that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Not an unreasonable position to arrive at. It might not be a right position or a wrong position or the most useful position, but we can generally understand how people arrive there. Been working with this founder for a little while, and he has struggled with some, fear problems and anxiety problems in his business. He kind of would avoid things because he's afraid of kind of, upsetting the status quo or that he might fail or whatever it may be. And, as we explored that to him, I'm like, well, what things do you do in your life that regularly require courage? And you could see him sitting there thinking on that, and momentarily he goes, well, kind of other than just like showing up to business and to work in general each day, I don't really think anything. I'm like, okay, so because you're not regularly engaging in something that requires you to be courageous deliberately, like of your own volition, i.e. engaging in things that are hard, right? Even easy things seem hard because you have no relative calibration of what actually is difficult. Now, this particular situation, played out in a really interesting way because he was like, oh, what could I do or should I do? And I was like, well, I did jiu-jitsu. That was one of the reasons I started. And he's like, cool. He's like, I'm going to do that then. And I was like, okay. I'm like, well, you come with me. We'll train.
Yeah.
You commit to 3 days a week for 3 months. And your thing is just arrive. Worry about nothing else. Just arrive. And the first night, he comes in and, I deliberately give him a little bit of a punish. And at the end of the class, I'm like, oh, so what are your reflections? And he's like, I was freaking out before even getting here. This is really hard. And I honestly, I thought I was going to die the whole time. Right? I'm like, cool, that's great. Well, look, let's go away and we'll see you tomorrow. Comes back the second day, goes through the class, and he's like, oh man, that was really hard tonight. And I'm like, okay, we'll just keep reflecting on that. Third night he comes back, he's like, oh dude, this is awesome. And I was like, well, were you freaking out that you were going to die tonight? He's like, no, not at all. And I'm like, was there ever any point in freaking out now that you know what you know 3 days later? And he's like, no. And I'm like, was there any other point in freaking out in your business? And he's like, no. Was there ever any point in avoiding all that stuff? No. And so having these experiences where you approach things that are like meaningfully uncomfortable to you, that generally instill fear and anxiety and or worry in you, right? But then like persevering through them, you normally get out the other side and have the realization, well, none of those things were actually ever that bad. Most of what occurs in your life that is bad occurs in your mind before it happens. And a lot of the time, it never even happens, right? And so from a business perspective, if you could adopt that mindset of courage, you'll realize that not only do a lot of those things never actually ever happen, if they do, they normally happen because you weren't courageous to begin with, and they could have been avoided anyway.
That makes total sense. I think, how important do you think it is, like that concept of having something outside of the business to challenge yourself?
At the end of the day, everyone is different. So everyone has a different mindset, different beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, whether it needs to be outside the business or not is kind of dependent on them. But I do believe, in a general sense, a safer way to live your life is to constantly do things that make you feel unsafe. Mm-hmm. Because then you get far better at dealing with the idea of not feeling so good all the time. A lot of people will make these complaints like, I just want to live a happy life, I just want to be happy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, but by virtue of you making that statement, well, I'm running on the assumption that you're currently not happy. Are you unhappy right now? And a lot of the time they'll go, oh, well, no, but I just want. And I'm like, so you're convincing yourself that you're unhappy so that you can strive for happiness, which is I think a fraudulent idea, in and of itself.
I agree.
So yeah, I think for a lot of people, the reason they feel so sad and unhappy is because they don't actually have anything to strive against. They have no battle to fight. And if you're an individual who proactively finds these battles to fight and challenges to face up against and overcome, you realize that the rest of life is actually pretty great. There's a lot of awesomeness there, but you can also accept that it won't always be great. And so you don't necessarily feel like you're always striving for happiness because you have a purpose to exist.
And what about if I said like the statement of like some people are made for it and some people aren't? True or false?
Yeah. I completely disagree with the idea that everyone could, would, and should be an entrepreneur. I think it's a very unsafe statement. And I don't say that from a position of disrespect. That's not what it's about. It's sort of like saying every single person could be LeBron James. Well, they can't. I'm never going to be that tall or athletic. It is statistically unlikely, right? And so the statement of everybody can be this or that people can be anything that they want in general is a very unsafe idea for society to adopt, in the sense that, one, it's very obviously and fundamentally untrue. And two, it actually also leads people to a lot of sadness and frustration, right? It doesn't mean that you can't try to be one, but not everyone's meant to be an entrepreneur in the same way that they're not all meant to be famous, super successful basketball players or athletes. That's not the way that the world works. Everyone is born with different fundamental traits, characteristics, and attributes, and or develop them throughout their life. And they should find an area to apply that to that brings them joy and solves their other kind of life problems or desires. But that doesn't necessarily always need to be owning and running an organization. I know a lot of people that have tried really hard to do that, who have actually just worked themselves into sadness.
That's the look. That would be the toughest thing, I think, for a lot of entrepreneurs to come to a decision, because it's a time thing, right? It's like, all right, I've got 20 years.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I got 20 years. I got from the age of 20, you'd say, to 40.
Whatever. Yeah, sure.
To kind of be as productive as I can.
Yep.
And you could waste 15 of those and never get there.
Sure. But this kind of comes back to like, what actually are your core drivers? Yeah, because one, not everyone's core drivers are the same. We all value different things differently, right? Number two, most people don't even really know what they value. That's why they get caught up doing things that they don't actually enjoy or like, because they're kind of chasing someone else's dream or idea, right? One of the best examples of this is people who go to university to get a degree. It's like, well, why are you here? It's like, oh, my parents said that, you just got to get this because it's safe and it's good, and you can get a good income and a good job, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, but you hate that, and you're not even driven by the outcome that could potentially provide you. So why are you doing it, right? And so I think, regardless of whether everyone is not an entrepreneur, which I don't believe is true at all, the first port of call here is figuring out, well, what do you actually care about in your life? What are the things, like, how do you want to live your life, right? Because a lot of people get into these things, play a sport or run a business, and they never have any consideration for what's actually required to get to the other side, right? Like I often say to people, I'm like, right now, is your current level of effort and sacrifice representative of the things that you say you desire? Because everyone in business at least goes, oh, I want to grow the business, I want to 10x, I want to make all this money. It's like, well, how much effort are you putting in, and what have you been sacrificing recently to achieve that? Because the answer is a mediocre effort and low to mediocre sacrifices. Well, then you should expect low to mediocre results, right? Don't expect extraordinary outcomes unless you are capable and willing to do extraordinary things. Otherwise, it's just an unreasonable dream that's only going to make you unhappy.
The next topic I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, which was risk. And you said, this is something I fundamentally agree with, and you said it just there, is that if you don't have much to risk, then you should be going as hard as you possibly can. Yeah. Can you talk to that a little bit? Because, and then I think it kind of ties in with what you just said as well, but this idea that, how do you think about risk? What's your advice for entrepreneurs in the early days with risk? Yeah. Because a lot of people seem to be scared of things that, losing things that aren't necessarily there. Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, and I was having a conversation with actually one of my co-founders recently for an organization I own about this. He's sitting there saying to me, well, I really back myself. But if I invest this money, then I lose it. Well, that's a bad thing. And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, like, financially that wouldn't necessarily be a great thing, but I'm like, what have you actually lost? Because like, you've already made all this money. You'd lose a portion of it. Do you believe that you can do that again? And then he's like, yeah, well, absolutely. I'm like, well, then you lose nothing. Because doing nothing is a much bigger risk to you than losing $500,000 or whatever the amount of money is. And I think the idea of risk here, and specifically for people like earlier in their journey in business, if you don't currently own any material assets, right, and you don't have any other kind of material ongoing obligations financially, i.e. kind of children or a mortgage or whatever it may be, what do you have to lose? Because right now you're losing time and opportunity by doing nothing. And that's much, much more expensive than money. So if you're someone who saved up $50,000 or $100,000, that may have taken you a large amount of time. But the reality is, if you quantify the risk of doing nothing, it is substantially larger. That $50,000 or $100,000 you might lose, but the skills that you develop losing that might make you $50 million. And so you have to be at some point in your journey open to risking a huge amount proportionately of what you've got, typically earlier on, to kind of get where you want to go. Now, if you're at the opposite end of the spectrum and maybe you've made a decent amount of money and you have some obligations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's just a value equation for you. Are you worried about going from a nice house, a nice car, and a nice lifestyle to a bad one? And do you have low or high belief in your capacity to get there? If you have full belief, you risk it all. Because to you, that's a two-way door, right? You can go through that, lose it all, and you can come back and make it all over again. If you don't have the belief and you're not willing to sacrifice those things, which would also be very reasonable, right? Well, then it's a one-way door. You can't come back through that door if that doesn't play out the way that you want it to. And so, for me now in my career, I think about, things from a proportionality basis. I'm like, I'm going to invest all of my money. So I'm going to risk all of it. But I'm going to try to find a way to allocate it to make sure that the likelihood that it all dies or is permanently destroyed is low. So they are, in many regards, two-way doors from a macro perspective, right? But early on, like right at the beginning of my journey, I think I had $60,000 in the bank. I spent $20,000 or $30,000 of that to try to build the first version of the ebook and website, right? And made a lot of money, subsequently off the back of that, right? But even prior to that, when I was running a bootcamp business, I would spend sort of 30, 40, 50% of my money on marketing material, and in retrospect, it probably did nothing for me and generated me no business.
Yeah.
But I would do that kind of on a semi-regular basis. I was like, well, I've got to do something to try to make this work. But if you live in a fear mindset where you're not willing to risk anything forever, regardless of your context, you're not going to get very far.
It's been something that's playing on my mind a lot lately, which is this idea that fundamentally risk is the biggest thing that you have to wrap your head around, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this idea that the more risk you take, the more, obviously I was going to say the more risk you take, fundamentally the bigger the reward can be, but that sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Like it has to pay off, right?
Yep.
But I think you fundamentally have to be okay with taking risk, and those risks as you get deeper and deeper, like you said, if you have a massive exit, the risk is high because you've got the money and you can lose it, but your framework before kind of does answer that. But it is something that I'm recognizing even in myself now is like, okay, you get to these kind of critical points, right? Where you've got these critical decisions and there is risk associated with all of those decisions. And then it's like, okay, I now have to make this decision and it's either progress or stagnate.
Well, and the thing with this for people in business too, the level of risk that you engage with and or kind of tolerate is not always the same in all situations for all people, right? So for you've built a successful business making production studios and production teams to deliver a large amount of high quality content for a variety of different businesses, right? If you were going to go and open 10 more of these studios, that's far lower risk for you than it is for me, right? Now, if those studios cost, just for argument's sake, say $2 million, right? The kind of objective quantified risk is effectively identical. $2 million to you is $2 million to me, right? But you've done this multiple times already and are doing it still right now successfully. I've never done it at all. So on a subjective basis, your risk is substantially lower than mine. Mine is drastically higher as a result of a capability deficit that I have on a relative basis to you, right? And so when you look at people like the Warren Buffetts of the world, right? Guy goes invest $100 billion in some huge thing. A lot of people go, oh, that's so much money. Oh my God, what if it goes wrong? It's like, yeah, but you're misinterpreting it. There are things that are available to him intellectually that most people don't even know exist. I probably never even heard of them, right? Because he is such an expert, he sees the world and investing in businesses in a very different way to you or I. One of the examples I give with this is if a musician plays a song on the piano and a self-taught 15-year-old kid who's been playing for 2 years plays the same piece of music, I don't know, 1,000 Miles by Vanessa Carlton, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorites. To the ordinary person on the street, they sound the same. It's the same song. There is no differentiation between the two. To a musician, they can clearly see a difference. This person's hitting all the right notes all the time. The timing is correct and more consistent. Their interpretation and articulation and inflection, or enunciation of the music is far more crisp and sophisticated than the person who's self-taught for a couple of years, right? But to the rest of the world, that's not visible. So in business, the same idea plays out. A lot of people look at things in business and go, oh, we all see business the same way. We absolutely do not. You see this business with far greater detail and clarity than I do, right? I see other businesses with far greater detail and clarity than other people do, right? And in those imperceptible differences between people who are kind of experts or at least very good at what they do versus people who have kind of no idea, that's where the value creation happens, right? But the people who have no idea don't have any idea that they have no idea. To them, it's just all one and the same. They don't have a great way of calibrating risk.
Do you think it can also go the other way though, where maybe people that do have a great idea
Absolutely.
have the opposite effect, right? Where they're not confident, you
Yeah.
know, or maybe they lack that confidence,
Absolutely.
and that stops them from taking the risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes naivety can be a massive advantage over knowledge, right? And that, like in business, one of the overarching things here is that not many things are rules; they're principles and guidelines, right? So you're like the whole more knowledge and more money always wins. Like that's not at all true. There is hundreds of very well documented examples of that not being true at all, right? Yeah, if it was true, then no one else would ever start a new company, and all the huge companies in the world would make all the money forever. Now they do a great job and whatever, but there's lots of people who are starting businesses making nice amounts of money alongside that. So it's not always just knowledge and money. There's other things, motivation, agency, desire. Right, there's lots of other contextual relevance, proximity. There's so many other things that need to kind of go together for each different type of business to work. But in a general sense, knowing more is very helpful.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because I feel like I went through an experience previously where I was in discussion with someone who's very successful in business and doing great things, and he had an opinion that really rocked me about the business, my business, and I was like, maybe he's right. I'm thinking maybe he's right, and in my head I'm kind of working through that, and it was a good 2 months to work through this. It was playing on my mind,
Yep.
because when you're in front of people, and I think that's like something that you have to get used to is like actually dissecting what someone's saying and then understanding the context, which comes back to what you just said, which was like there's a lot of detail I have that person doesn't have.
Absolutely.
And anyway, I fundamentally got to this. 2 months later, I just said no. Like I actually think he's wrong, right? And I'm gonna do that. And then anyway, it turns out had another conversation, and that perception changed. But if I hadn't have kind of gone through that process myself, I probably would have just accepted that was the case. And maybe it was a lack of confidence. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe there's the idea that you put people up on a pedestal, right? And that can affect you a little bit. But it made me think just then with what you just said, this idea that it can probably go both ways, right? You can lack confidence and not take the risk, and you can have too much confidence and take uncalculated risks, and they can both be detrimental.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes with these things too, there's a nuanced difference between knowledge and understanding. So I can kind of know that these things exist, but I don't necessarily fully understand how they work, why, when, where, how, all these sorts of things. And in business specifically, that's a very dangerous differentiation to not understand, in the sense that if you go, oh yeah, I know finance, I know P&Ls, I've kind of seen those. Great. But do you understand why are they designed that way? And what are the rules that govern the structure of a P&L? That's very different to being like, oh, I can read, revenue, COGS, gross margin, cost of sales, contribution margin, OPEX, EBITDA, maybe there's some other stuff. Oh, I can kind of understand your kind of cash flow and balance sheet. Knowing those things exist versus really understanding how they work.
So like that's something that's like, in my opinion, like though when you go to that, you're right. Like there's that basic stuff, but then there's that second layer.
Yeah, it's details,
even just
man.
with like what you just said, the balance sheet, and it's just like, you've said it multiple times. There's levels to it, and I feel like
absolutely. Yeah, I stumbled across a guy online a couple of years ago. His name's Jason Andrew. He owns a company with a few other people called SBO. They're like an accounting firm, support a lot of businesses, specifically quite a lot of e-com businesses. And I really rate his intelligence and knowledge. He's been working alongside the accounting firm to build an investment business that has a very somewhat unique investment philosophy, right? Anyway, he writes these blogs and articles, and I read a few of his things, and I was like, damn, this guy knows a lot of stuff, not only that I don't know about, but I don't understand at all. So I reached out to him. I was like, dude, let's go for breakfast. Like, I want to learn from you.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've been kind of, chatting on and off, for the last couple of years. And I think that idea there, like that seems all really fun and basic and obvious, right? But not many people will do that. Like, I consider my finance knowledge to be pretty good. I'd say it's above average, right? This guy is so far ahead of me.
Yeah.
Like, I literally reached out to him a few weeks ago. I'm like, oh, you just wrote a post about this metric. I actually didn't come across that before. Like, what do I read? And he sends me links like, read this book. This talks about it. I'm like, beauty, right? But that's because I'm super happy to acknowledge I don't know a lot about these specific things. And when you can get to that point of saying, oh, I'm aware or maybe even not aware of this, but even if I am, I just don't really understand it and I think there's value there, then you can kind of hunt out, that knowledge. But a lot of people don't want to do that. The example before about the founder who doesn't want to, be courageous in front of other people and say, I don't know. I don't want to let down my management team or look like the fool who doesn't know or understand. I'm like, it's the other way around. There's so much value in that because the reality is most people in the management team don't know either. Right?
Yeah, it's 100%. But it's so interesting what you're saying. Like I seen there's someone that you must speak to recommended a book on Instagram. It was a financial literacy book.
Financial intelligence for entrepreneurs.
100%.
Yeah.
So
Green and white cover, yeah.
I've started reading that. But not just reading it. I went to the part, so going deep on balance sheets because I felt like that was probably a bit of a weakness of mine.
Sure.
And it's just funny, like there's so much that you don't know that just one little decision, split decision to reach out to hunt for that little bit of knowledge.
Yep.
And it's probably completely shifted just how we're going to be operating.
But this is the thing, right? And all tremendously good business people can do this. They don't just, not only are they open to learning, they will hunt out learning. And not only do they hunt out learning, once they have learned something, they will try to immediately implement it in a context in their organization that adds value. Because there's no value to be gained from the aggregation of knowledge. Knowing a lot of things doesn't necessarily mean you get value from them. Using the knowledge and applying it through skill in your organization in a relevant context is actually where the value becomes, or is the value is developed rather. And again, like it sounds so obvious, but not a lot of people are willing to do that. It comes back to this simple idea. You want to be healthy, eat better food, do a bit of exercise. The majority of the people on the planet don't do that. So this is not even just a straight out knowledge problem, right? It's an emotional problem.
Yeah.
Like the emotions are at the root of almost all of these challenges.
It comes back to what we were saying before. Okay, so there's two myths or two things I want to finish on. The first one, the kids debate.
Yeah.
Right? I feel like, I just turned 31, but the idea that once you start getting to like 27 and above, that's a stereotype, but like a lot of people start having these conversations. Oh, like, should I have a kid?
Yep.
Is it, should I grow the business a bit more? Should I do this? Should I do that? I'd love to get your opinion on it. What do you like? Is it a superpower having a kid? Is it detrimental? Is it not, to the business? Like, what is that? What is that conversation to you?
Yeah, I think, let's start from the position that, from my experience anyway, a lot of people complain about kids on the other side of having had them, that they've taken away their life or this, that, or the other, right? And not a rule, but in a general sense, like that was their decision, right? And so the problem actually is their lack of accountability.
Yeah.
It's not actually the children, right? I think, a lot of people will say like, oh, I'm going to lose all my time, this, that, the other. I won't be able to work on my business to win, blah, 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 whatever it may be. I'll say to them, well, if that's going to be your justification for not wanting to have children, you sure as hell want to make sure that you don't waste a minute of your time at the moment.
That's so true, isn't it?
Right. And most people waste a lot of time, right? So then that argument kind of goes out the window. Now, to be clear, if you don't want to have kids, cool. That's your preference.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong.
That's also totally fine, right? But I think a lot of people will use that as a justification or an excuse to not do things. Yeah, which is sort of like saying, I'm not going to go for a run because it's cold. It's like, that's not a real answer. Like, unless you're in a very, very unique part of the world, generally cold is not really a good answer.
Yeah.
Or I'm tired isn't really a good answer. And just to be clear, this is coming from a person, I was very selfish, very focused, very driven, still am, have been for a very long time in my life. I was not, initially, like early on in my 20s, I was not really at all paternal. I was so focused on winning. And then when that opportunity came up and had my daughter, it's completely changed my life for the better. And one of the big things is that I realized I wasted a lot of time, right? A huge amount of time. Now, I don't necessarily think I work meaningfully less than when I did without having a child, but I waste meaningfully less time.
It's just focus, isn't it? Like I say the same thing. Like for me, it just removed all the clutter and shit out of my life. The stuff that I was spending time on that I probably didn't need to, it wasn't really adding anything to my life.
Yep.
So I totally agree with that. I think it does make you more focused, and it it does teach you a lot about how selfish. I kind of said the first time I realized I was really selfish was when I got a dog.
Yeah.
And then the kid is like 100 times that.
Many layers beyond. Yeah.
And they just teach you so much too about yourself. So I love that answer. The second one is loneliness in business.
Yeah.
So I would love to kind of get a gauge of, I've heard you talk about it before, but I think it is obviously just a stark reality in business. Like, how do you think about that? And then more importantly, like, how did you deal with it and manage it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've said many times before that, and especially in business, loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of connection or capacity to relate, right? And so if for the founder's role, purely by default of the fact that you've decided to start a business, you already can't relate to the vast majority of people in your life, right? They can't understand the existential threat, that you experience in some regards probably on a daily basis, right? That's not going to happen. So by virtue of them not being able to relate or connect with that aspect of your life, in some regards, that's a kind of unconscious sacrifice on your behalf, right? When you choose to engage on this thing, you're choosing to let go of, a part of that, right? And a lot of people will say, like, oh, I'm really happy to sacrifice, for success because I want to get to success, but they misunderstand the value that you get from success isn't the destination, it's who you become on the journey on the way there, right? And part of the thing that changes for a huge amount of people in business is that they become more self-sufficient. Because entering, the idea of founding an organization for yourself, it's one of the very few things that will stare right back at you in the mirror every day and hold you fully accountable for every single thing that you do. There's not many things in your life that will do that. You can be employed and be mediocre and kind of get through. You can be in your relationship and be moderately present and scathe through. You can hang out with your family and friends and be kind of moderately engaged and scathe through. That's all totally fine, right? You can't moderately engage with an organization that you want to try and build. It is in some regards all consuming. And as a result of that, you have to sacrifice a lot of connectivity with other people. Lots of people will say, you kind of become a product of the 5 people that you surround yourself with, so kind of try to surround yourself with the best possible people. I don't think that's necessarily fully untrue. Like, I think there's certainly some value in that. But you also need to remember that you still can't rely on those people to solve your problems. Your problems are still your problems. And coming back to some of the themes that we've spoken about today, those 5 people might be able to give you a huge amount of knowledge. You might be able to connect with them and feel less lonely on the journey. But when push comes to shove and you got to fix your shit, it's still all on you. That's still a you thing. And people will commonly misinterpret the experience of loneliness in business by saying, I just want to hang out with people that get it. But that's not when you're feeling lonely. You're feeling lonely and isolated when you got to go into that conversation and fire that person. You're feeling lonely and isolated when you're sitting there looking at the balance sheet and going, shit, well, we don't have any money. We're going to go broke in 6 weeks. You're feeling lonely when everyone in your team is looking at you and going, well, we're in this position that's bad. What do we do? That's lonely, right? And no matter how well you connect with other founders, friends, family, partner, or whatever it may be, a lot of them are not going to be able to relate to that. And even if they can, they're not going to be able to do that for you. And so in entrepreneurship and on the journey to building your business, yes, loneliness is omnipresent and it's really bloody hard. Surrounding yourself with people that can relate to that is definitely a bit of a tool or a cheat code to making it more, tolerable on the way in. But a lot of this loneliness comes from a lack of courage and a lack of self-belief. Because in a simple sense, when you're lonely, you're feeling isolated, you want to be able to rely on other people to help make you feel better. You want to be able to rely on other people to understand what you're going through, and you want to be able to rely on people hopefully to fix some of your problems. That doesn't really exist in business, because even if someone gives you the answer, you still got to do it. So yes, combat that by finding people you can connect with if that's feasible. But if you can have a proactive approach to trying to remember that this is still all about you and it's all on you, how courageous you can be is going to have a massive impact on your ability to kind of withstand or survive the loneliness that's going to be there for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's a lot of it's about being able to actually manage that and deal with it and kind of just exist with it. And then eventually you're saying it that turns.
Yeah, so think about this, right? The person who wants to be happy says, all I want to do is live a happy life and be happy. It's like the founder that says, I just don't want to be lonely. I just want people to understand me. Well, why the hell did you start a business?
Yeah.
Right? That's just saying I just want to be really comfortable and not sweat or feel pain. Well, why'd you go to the gym? A lot of these things in society, people want to kind of invert the reality and then hope it's true.
When you accept them.
Yeah. You have to accept that, unhappiness is a part of life. You have to accept that loneliness is not only a part of life, but a very prevalent experience in business. Right?
It's part of the job.
Yeah. And you can't expect to get to the destination of success and winning and joy or pleasure or whatever it may be that you think is on the other side without some form of pain. What you thought this was going to be easy, give up now. Because it's not going to be easy. It's going to be really bloody hard. And if it was easy, then everyone would be hyper successful.
That's a beautiful answer. I just feel like it's the truth. There's no two ways about it in terms of you just have to accept it. That's part of it. And then once you accept it, your whole demeanor changes, your whole attitude towards yourself, and that kind of it all just starts to shift.
Well, if we go back to the story before about the guy who came to jiu-jitsu to try train for a couple of days, who's still going, and I'll probably train with him tonight, right? The primary thing that changed between day 1 and day 3 is his expectation, right? On day 1, he showed up expecting it to maybe not be that bad and but being really afraid, right? On day 3, he expected it to be shit and uncomfortable and challenging. So any experience by default is better than that. If you show up to work every day expecting it to be pleasurable and enjoyable and winning and, flying cash everywhere, you're going to be real sad for a very long time. If you expect to have a relationship with your lover and it to be cuddles and kisses and romance all the time, you're going to be really upset for all the time. If you expect to have kids and for it to not be occasionally kind of draining or exhausting or frustrating, it's well, you're in for a rough time. So I think with a lot of these things, the negative emotion that we experience with a lot of these things in life comes from the fact that there is an incongruence between what we hope is going to happen and what actually happens in reality. And no matter how long you hope for, and no matter how hard you hope that it's going to be easy or fun or enjoyable, a lot of these things in life, business being one of them, a lot of the experience is bloody hard. A lot of the experience is bloody lonely. And the quicker that you can get to a point where you accept and expect that, the more tolerable and more joyful your experience will be on the journey.
That's a really good place to finish, I think. Yeah. Tob, a massive thanks for coming on the show again.
Thanks for hosting me.
Mate, I could chat to you all day. I could literally sit here and just absorb a lot of that knowledge because it's every time I talk to you, I just feel like I'm getting smacked between the eyes.
Honesty is the best policy, mate.
Yeah, just yeah, you doing that? Nah. Yeah. But again, a massive I'm very appreciative of your time, and I actually haven't shot a pod in a while, so this would have been first in a while. So we're back, and I hope you guys enjoyed the episode.
Thanks heaps, man.